Welcome, I am Palindromic Time. In this video, I will be commentating a mono white Death and Taxes set I played against Gruul Ponza in Modern. Now, for those who don't know, Death and Taxes is a tempo deck that uses creatures with disruptive abilities to kill their opponent before the opposing player has a chance to respond. In contrast, Gruul Ponza is a mid-range deck that uses ramp spells, blood moon effects, and strong creatures to outvalue and outpace their opponents. Now that the table is set, let's jump into the match. Looking at my opening hand, it's not perfect. Culture Complete is essentially a dead card unless I top deck Stoneforge Mystic. Additionally, I don't have any spells to cast on turn 1. That being said, Leonin Arbiter and Thalia, Guardian of Draven, are two strong disruptive creatures, and I have the mana to cast them. My opponent decides to fetch for Stomping Grounds. This is what made me initially guess they were playing Ponza. For turn 2, I decide to play a second Basic Plains. This is a slight misplay. By drawing the second Plains, I guarantee myself the ability to pay for all the colored pips in my deck. However, none of the cards in my hand require white to be cast. It would have been better to either play Ganjo, Castle, or Flagstones of Cure to try to bait out an unproductive Blood Moon from my opponent. Next, I decide to cast Leonin Arbiter. This is a bit of a cheeky play. If my opponent doesn't fetch before Leonin Arbiter enters the battlefield, they won't be able to get their land drop for the turn. However, my opponent is a smart player and does fetch. Additionally, I have two Thalias in hand. It would be better to disrupt and bait out removal from my opponent by casting one of those copies. For turn 3, my opponent cast a Fury, killing my Esper Sentinel and Leonin Arbiter. Going back to my turn 2 play, I could have maintained the latter's tax effect along with Thalia for the rest of the game if I had sequenced better. Passing back to me, I decide to play Thalia. Her tax effect is strong, and her first strike ability stonewalls my opponent's seasoned Pyromancer and creature tokens. Additionally, I have two copies in hand, and I don't expect whichever creature I cast to survive through removal next turn. My opponent decides to cast Bloodbraid Elf, and here is where we see the power of Thalia's taxing effect. They would have been able to cast Lightning Bolt for free, but with Thalia's tax effect, that becomes impossible, and Bloodbraid Elf becomes a weak 3/2 creature for 4 mana that can't even profitably trade with Thalia. Aether Vial is a good draw even with the Thalia tax on non-creature spells. It will allow me to cast my spells at instant speed in the future. Additionally, I'll be able to spend all my mana by playing Stoneforge Mystic as well. I'm still uncertain whether Stoneforge Mystic will survive, so I grab a Sword of Fire and Ice. It's a good choice. If I can keep it on a creature, it essentially invalidates all of my opponent's red creatures and removal, and it further helps me hedge my bets. If Stoneforge Mystic survives, I can cast the Bomb Cauldron Melistic for 2 mana. Finally, I decide not to attack with Thalia, even though she's likely to get through. She generates more value for me by stonewalling every opposing creature my opponent has in play, and my opponent has less life than me anyways, so I'm ahead on tempo. My opponent is able to chain several spells together. The Noble Hierarch's Exalted ability allows them to get in for 4. However, I am still ahead in life total and virtual card advantage, so I decide not to chump block. After that, I untap, draw a Giver of Runes, and decide to put an equipment into play using Stoneforge Mystic's ability. Looking at the best bang for my buck, Cauldron Complete is my choice. However, while this decision ultimately wins the game, I did make a mistake while sequencing. I should have left a Ganjo Castle untapped to protect my Thalia from a potential run and 6 down tick. So, sideboarding for this matchup is a very easy process. All of my opponent's interaction, along with most of their creatures, are red. Replacing Giver of Runes with Birds and Forge Tender allows me to stonewall all of their creatures and stop mine from being killed by a well-timed Fury like in Game 1. Looking at my opening hand for turn 2, this is nearly perfect. I had everything I could want for this matchup. The only risk is that it's a one-lander. If my opponent has early removal for my Aether Vial, I may not be able to cast my spells. That being said, I am on the draw and have another game to play even if I lose, so I decide to keep. So for turn 1, I repeat a mistake I made earlier. It would have been better for me to play the non-basic land before the basic planes to try to bait out an irrelevant Blood Moon from my opponent again. So, engineered explosives on 2 is an odd decision for my opponent. I haven't cast a single 2-mana permanent so far, and it's easy to play around since they haven't popped it once it enters the battlefield. Playing it on 1 would have been a much more lucrative decision for them. After that, I make a very strong play, deciding to cast Stoneforge Mystic, again fetching Sword and Fire and Ice, as a potential bait for my opponent to pop engineered explosives for very little value. In addition, I'm prepared to violate and sacrifice Birds and Forge Tender if they use targeted removal against the Stoneforge. I decide to not violate in preemptively because I don't want them to have that information to play around. So my opponent decides to cast Stomp to get rid of my Stoneforge Mystic, or I could vial in my Birch and Forge Tender to stop this from happening. Most of the value of keeping Stoneforge around has already been depleted, so I decided to save my Birch for later. Next, they cast Bone Crusher Giant. This is when I decide to vial in Birch and to stonewall my opponent's largest creature. Something important to note about this interaction is the mana value of the creatures. Mine effectively costs us nothing coming off Wraither Vial, while theirs costs them 3 mana. Such interactions put me well ahead of my opponent in terms of tempo and virtual card advantage. Finally, I untap, and this is where things start to get extra fun. I begin by casting Aether Vial so I can start getting value from it as soon as possible. Next, looking at the board, my opponent has 3 creatures in play. Checking my hand, I see that I can destroy all of them using the Pitch Solitude Ephemerate combo. The way this works is by discarding a white card to cast Solitude for free. Then you stack the triggers so that the exile trigger resolves first. Once that occurs, you can then respond to the sacrifice trigger by casting Ephemerate targeting Solitude. This allows you to exile another creature and keep the Solitude in play. Awesome stuff. Next, I would like to highlight the creatures that I choose to exile first. Arbor Elf and Ignoble Hierarch currently provide my opponent with the most value. They allow my opponent to cheat on mana and cast more and bigger spells before they would normally be able to. Additionally, Virgin Forge Tinder is already blocking Bone Crusher Giant, so I'm not concerned about it. My opponent tries to salvage the situation by bolting my Solitude. However, I decide to save it by sacrificing Burton. This may seem like an odd play based on how I previously appraised the value of the creature. However, Ephemerate will rebound at the beginning of my upkeep next turn, and let me kill Bone Crusher Giant anyway. With that devastating play, my opponent decides to concede the match. Now that we've finished the set, I've hoped you learn a few things. First, you've seen the importance of proper sequencing. I also hope you've recognized the distinction between virtual and non-virtual card advantage, and that even when we win, there are still mistakes that we can clean up for the future. If you found this video engaging, please let me know, and feel free to ask any questions in the comment section below. Finally, consider playing Death and Taxes yourself. It's an underrated deck.